This is a competitive team from Gen 5 OU, and this is a competitive team from Gen 9 OU. You'll notice, folks, that the teams are exactly the same. But that's no big deal, of course. We all know that we can use Pokemon from old generations in new games. What's the big deal? Well, this Gen 5 team has reached an impressive rating of number 4 on the Gen 9 ladder. All of these Pokemon were OU ranked back in Gen 5, but in the modern times, they're not quite holding up to scrutiny. Tyranitar is UU now, which is pretty crazy to see. Mamoswine's all the way down in RU. Even Keldeo dropped, Amoonguss dropped. Excadrill and Gliscor are the only 2 OU ranked Pokemon on this team. This Gen 5 OU team is built by ABR, and while the team itself is not over 10 years old, the metagame that it's from is. Pokemon Black and White 2 came out back in 2012, folks. And while this is a more modern Gen 5 OU team, sand structures similar to this definitely did exist back then. Excadrill wasn't on them because it was banned back then, it was recently unbanned, but Stoutland was legal back then as a Sand Rush user. And I think this is fantastic. This player, Dragonite4242, took the old Gen 5 team and revamped it for Gen 9. Of course, most of these Pokemon are very different now. Pursuit no longer exists. Amoonguss has a whole different role because in Gen 5 it can't even use Spore, now it can. Sand Rush plus Sandstream are legal now because permanent sand is no longer a thing, so that's a whole different role for Excadrill and Tyranitar. So let's take a look at each of these Pokemon and see how they've been tweaked to thrive in the Gen 9 environment. And I think something you'll notice right off the bat is that Gliscor remains absolutely unchanged. Same exact set, same EV spread, everything is the same on Gliscor. I mean, this is just a Pokemon that has stood the test of time, and I did a whole video about this, about Gliscor specifically, but Poison Heal is one of the best abilities in the game. It grants a effective immunity to status, and kind of an immunity to knockoff, since getting knocked off doesn't affect your ability to chip heal. And the chip heal is enormous, 1/8 is much more than leftovers. It's an extremely high value ability. Ground flying typing is excellent, utility is excellent, stats are excellent. This is just held up to this day, and in fact in Gen 9 it's even better. It got spikes as a new option, it can now terrestrialize, and hidden power no longer exists, so ice coverage is less prevalent. I think it's pretty awesome that Gliscor didn't even need to be changed at all, not even the EV spread had to change. The same, however, cannot be said for Tyranitar, who is extremely different from Gen 5 to Gen 9. Back in Gen 5, this has an argument to be the best Pokemon in OU. It's certainly one of the most central and common and powerful, largely due to the fact that it has the powerful Pursuit move, which keeps at bay the famous Latios, threats like Alakazam, Reuniclus, the occasional Gengar. Permanent Sand in Gen 5 was an enormous deal, metagame defining, team archetype defining. Its incredible move pool, access to Stealth Rock, Thunder Wave, utility like that, and flexibility. Not only a central sand setter, weather setter, but also an important check to common threats in the metagame. It's just a staple. It's a staple. In Gen 9, however, you never really see Tyranitar anymore. It doesn't have Pursuit anymore. Permanent Sand is no longer a thing. But things aren't all bad for Tyranitar in Gen 9 anymore. It's got a bit more merit now that Excadrill has returned, the first viable Sand Rush user in a while. This is a really good win condition. It has 135 base attack, which is enormous. It can obviously outrun the whole metagame when Sand is active. Air Balloon also gives it good entry points against common Pokemon like enemy Gliscor, enemy Great Tusk. Terra Ghost is also a cool option. If you come in on a Great Tusk Headlong Rush, Terra Ghost, Swords Dance, they close combat, you're completely immune. You can also wall Zamazenta with that. They commonly have Body Press as their only move. Spike stacking strategies are also very common, so the temporary spike immunity really helps out. And in a pinch, you can be a Rapid Spinner. If you don't want to use this as your win con, you can just get a speedy Rapid Spin off. Goldango is going to be afraid of you, they're not going to come in. And Tyranitar is not solely the guy that just makes sand for Excadrill. It's actually not bad in its own right, despite losing many of its most important options. It does have knockoff now, which is a great benefit. They gave it something at least, we love that. Knockoff is one of the best moves in the game. Tyranitar is a natural user of it with Stab, Dark, massive attack, spreading item removal is always great. And Tyranitar's vast coverage also really comes in handy. Ice Beam can hit Gliscor, Fire Blast hits Skarmory, Corviknight, and Low Kick can hit King Gambit and Ting Lu for big damage. And the ability to terrestrialize flying on Tyranitar can actually be quite high value, even though it's gonna spend your Terra for the game, meaning you can't use it on Keldeo or Excadrill or those fellows. It can earn you a big surprise KO, for example a Great Tusk clicking a Headlong Rush, you hit him with the Expert Belt Ice Beam suddenly. It's a lot safer for Excadrill to sweep now that their Great Tusk has fallen. You can basically use this Terra Flying as a resource to trade with one important enemy Pokemon, which is really nice. I made a whole video about why I think Mamoswine is a really well designed Pokemon, and I stand by that. This is one of my favorite Pokemon ever. I love the ice ground typing. It's beautiful both offensively and defensively. Ground covers the rock weakness for ice, meaning this can actually come in against stealth rock, even though it's an ice type. Ice ground is almost an unresisted stab combination, I think, besides like Rotom Wash being able to withstand it. And it's also not so fast that it's overwhelming or anything. Thick Fat is also a beautiful choice because it neutralizes fire type attacks, making you a little bit sturdier defensively. This is one of the few ice type offensive Pokemon that isn't just a complete glass cannon. It has some defensive merits. I really love this Pokemon. I like that it has access to Ice Shard too for priority, making up for its low speed, but of course being a punishable move in its own right if they guess you're going to do it, because there's a lot of common resistances to ice. And Mamoswine is being used in very much the same way it was back in Gen 5, and it has a lot of the same advantages. The amazing offensive type profile, the great ice stab option. It does have knockoff now, which is a significant buff. Back in Gen 5, knockoff wasn't as powerful. It didn't have the 65 power and the damage multiplier when you're knocking off an item, so wasn't really used as an offensive option back in Gen 5. In the Smogon post for this team, Dragonite mentions that they think Mamoswine is underexplored in this metagame, and I actually agree. I think Mamoswine has a lot of awesome advantages. It's pretty nice into Raging Bolt because you're immune to electric and you hit them super effectively with priority Ice Shard. Thick Fat also helps out a lot against gouging fire, and you offensively threaten that very well. You got enough natural bulk to withstand it too. Funnily enough, back in Gen 5, one of the best advantages of Mamoswine was Icicle Crash, because this could pressure Skarmory with big neutral damage without making contact and activating Rocky Helmet. And guess what? Skarmory is back in Gen 9, often using Rocky Helmet, and Mamoswine is good again for very much the same reason. It can pressure in their main physical wall, do a lot of damage and not be worried about Rocky Helmet chip. Plus the 30% flinch really pressures Skarmory, meaning it can't heal repeatedly or it's vulnerable to this disruption and getting broken through eventually. Keldeo, on the other hand, is looking completely different. A lot of options this was using back in Gen 5 are no longer available in Gen 9. And on the contrary, a lot of new options are available in Gen 9 that weren't in Gen 5. Scald, no longer available on Keldeo. Hidden Power removed from the game completely. Toxic, massive moveset cuts, also not available on Keldeo anymore. However, Keldeo now has access to Vacuum Wave for priority. That's enormous. That can threaten a lot of speedy fellows that are neutral to fighting, which is many of them. You can hit Darkrai for super effective damage, Greninja, Roaring Moon if they haven't terastallized. You can finish off something like a Gouging Fire that's Dragon Danced up, a Kyurem Dragon Danced up. A spare priority option is always useful in this metagame. It's always going to come in handy. And Keldeo has another new option in the form of Flip Turn, some crucial pivoting. This is always useful on a Pokemon like this that's going to force defensive switches to special walls. I mean, you can switch in against something like Slowking Galar trying to come in against Secret Sword or Surf or something and flip turn into Mamoswine. All of a sudden you're in an amazing spot. Situations like that are going to come up a lot. You can do the same against Toxapex. They resist your stab combo completely, but you flip turn into Mamoswine, all of a sudden they're in a huge amount of trouble. And finally we have Amoonguss, who also is working very differently from generation to generation. Back in Gen 5, sleep is actually banned completely, and that's a more recent development. If you don't know, folks, the sleep mechanics in Gen 5 work a bit differently. Every time a Pokemon switches out, the sleep counter resets. So even if you sit with a slept Pokemon for 3 turns, switch out and back in, you got to start all over again in terms of the sleep counter. So sometimes Pokemon will just never wake up. Sleep is extremely powerful in Gen 5 to the point where they felt it needed to be banned. I don't know why they made sleep work differently in Gen 5 specifically. Always thought that was a bit weird. But anyway, even though Amoonguss can't use Spore in Gen 5, it's still a solid Pokemon that is sometimes seen, purely for its defensive merits. Regenerator is an amazing ability. Grass Poison typing comes in handy. You can remove toxic spikes, you can soak status, things like that. Pretty nice Pokemon in a world where Scald is so common, because getting burned with Regenerator is no big deal. It's great into rain teams that rely on big water type damage. It also checks opposing Pokemon such as Breloom, and it can at least spread paralysis, which is pretty valuable. But of course in Gen 9, Amoonguss can use Spore freely, which is obviously a must-have on this Pokemon, 100% accurate sleep move. I think Amoonguss works quite well actually alongside Tyranitar and Excadrill, who can sometimes lure in and pressure Goldengo, which makes your Spore more valuable and less exploitable. And the remaining moveset options on Amoonguss are just filler attacks, pretty similar to how it was used back in the day. In Gen 5 they prefer HP Fire, which can threaten Ferrothorn. Obviously HP Fire is no longer available, but Foul Play is nice to threaten Dragon Dance Sweepers and Swords Dance Sweepers. Overall, I think this is fantastic, folks. taking a Gen 5 team, revamping it for the modern metagame. I'm sure this started out as a fun little experiment and the results were surprising. It actually performed really well. Sometimes innovation can come from just having fun and experimenting, thinking outside the box a little bit. And hopefully this will lead people to reevaluate Pokemon like Mamoswine, Keldeo, and Tyranitar, who weren't very popular, haven't been very popular recently, but actually have a lot going for them, it turns out. They work pretty well together too. The synergy of this team, even though the sets are different, the synergy remains pretty similar and they cover each other nicely. I'll link the team below, as well as the Smogon thread with a pretty detailed explanation into all the matchups. Very good thread, I would urge you to look through it. Thank you to Dragonite for building this team, showing it to us. And I would also like to thank Tyranitar for still thriving years later. Look at you go, you're still a Pokemon. Many would deny it. Thank you for watching, folks.